The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
So what I'd like to do is maybe talk a little bit about the world into which the world that Darwin was part of, some of the background and some of the things that were happening that help us understand and frame the work of Darwin. We've already looked at some very important books. I mean, we just finished with Malthus. And Malthus was definitely a figure that Darwin was familiar with. I wouldn't say Malthus gave Darwin his arguments, but Malthus was part of a general intellectual background that Darwin was familiar with and actually had read carefully. But he had read many other figures carefully too. He was a very, very careful man. He read things, he pondered them, and he was probably one of the most widely read individuals of his time. He was also a person who was hugely curious about all things related to the natural world. He had a passion for the natural world. He was very interested in domestic breeding. He knew about horses and all sorts of things that had to do with the breeding of special forms, and the fact that humans were pretty good breeders. They knew how to take animals and shape them through selective breeding over a period of time. And Darwin was fascinated with this whole problem, and he had correspondence, a huge correspondence with people who were breeders. He had grown up himself in a small city, but that was in a kind of very agricultural area of England, in the northwest part, Shrewsbury, and so he was quite familiar with the countryside. A little different than living in London. Okay, so and as we've already looked at Adam Smith. I mean, people were promulgating ideas of the way in which the economy worked, the world. So there was a lot of thinking of the style that relates very closely to the thinking style of Charles Darwin. And so, just in general, there was a massive curiosity about the physical world. How astronomy, the new astronomy of the Herschels, there was the geology and the work of geologists like Hutton and Charles Lyell. And then there was tremendous interest in botany and identifying the various organisms and not just identifying them, but classifying them in orderly fashion. So all this was part of the world that Darwin was born into. And so if we're looking for the person who influenced and sort of inspired Darwin, we'd have to say there were lots of things. He was just a naturally curious individual. And so that's really what we're focusing on here at the start. So there's the Great Voyage, the Voyage of the Beagle, which took place over an extended period, and Darwin was part of that. So it's a great subject. There's a tremendous amount going on in this book, and it's a big book, and it reads a little different from the way a textbook would read, or indeed a paper. So this is sort of Darwin's synthesis of his ideas, and he synthesized this in a big book. He called it an abstract. Did you pick up on that? This is this whole work is kind of a summary of a much bigger concept he has. So here's somebody, 1859 when it was published, who has been working in this field for many, many years. I mean, at least if we date it from the time he went out on his voyage, we've got more than 25 years of work here. So Darwin was somebody who was very deliberate and who thought deeply about his subjects and didn't rush out to publish. He was trying to clarify for himself what he thought. And he had many earlier versions of these arguments. This was his first large, organized public statement about the phenomenon of evolution or origin of species. Yeah, Claire.
If, like Casey said, there was somebody else working on a similar idea at the same time, do we know if all of his ideas were original or?
Oh yeah. There were. So let me say a little bit about what some of the things at Darwin's time. Okay, so Darwin, of course, the famous voyage of the Beagle, which took place over a period of 5+ years, and this was something that Darwin recorded in some detail in his Journal of Researches, which was the original title of the Voyage of the Beagle. And he had taken this tremendous voyage around the world as a young man, and he was able to, at this time, learn about the kind of global perspective of the geology and biology that he was interested in. So it gave him a tremendously rich experience to think with. And indeed, this voyage was a profound part of Charles Darwin's thinking for the rest of his life. And he made many observations. You can just see from the quotes I've included here from chapter 17 what sorts of things were on Darwin's mind. The natural history of these islands is eminently curious. Most of the organic productions are aboriginal creations found nowhere else. He's talking about the Galapagos. So these kind of islands, somebody was mentioning last class or the class before the fact that islands sometimes help you think about things because they put boundaries on things. And in some ways, the Galapagos is a boundary. And it's got its own set of organisms, and it allows you to see a difference. But Darwin could also see patterns that he could associate with other forms on the mainland, but no longer the same species. So did this island, just for some miraculous reason, get organisms created just for itself, or what's, how did this all happen? How did this come to be, that there were these aboriginal forms, aboriginal creations, he calls them. So, seeing every height crowned with its crater and the boundaries of most of the lava streams still distinct, we are led to believe that within a period geologically recent, and geologically recent could be a long time. I mean, it's not just a few thousand years, because he's already thinking in terms. I'll show you some of Charles Lyell's work, but Darwin was a follower of Lyell's work, a close follower of Charles Lyell's work, and he was familiar with the work of other geologists of the day, and they had discovered a whole range of things, including the fact that the Earth was incalculably older than most people thought, more in the millions of years. And so, Darwin had this time framework now in the background. He was aware of this concept of, we might call deep time, that, the age of the Earth was vast. And so there was lots and lots of time for things to change. So incrementalism doesn't mean a whole lot if you're talking about a very short period of time. But if you're talking about vast periods of times, little tiny incremental changes over millions of years can amount to tremendous. Okay, so differences. Most of the lava streams are still distinct. We are led to believe that within a period geologically recent, the unbroken ocean was here spread out. Hence, both in space and time, we seem to be brought somewhat near to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth. What do you make of that? This is from his Voyage of the Beagle. Do you think he's, what's he referring to here?
What I take from chapter 17 is that if you've got a common ancestor living on some piece of land, then for some reason the environment changes, whether by separation of land or whatever, you've now got the same species or group of animals on two different environments, and that based upon all the stuff he's already introduced us to, when you put the same animal in two very different environments over many, many periods of time, those two animals will totally separate and become two new things. So when it says that the appearance of the new beings on this earth, that's the image I get of what he's talking about, is separation and then readapting to the new environment and then change for the good.
He seems to be,
yes. This is the notion that seems to be referred to here. He's not quite clear back in the 30s exactly how this happens, but he knows something is happening and that they are coming from these aboriginal forms, these new forms, have some ancestral origin, very likely, in the forms of the mainland. And somehow they have expressed and developed themselves in a new way in these isolated environments where they are, in some sense, sequestered. So this is a really big idea, and this idea is one of the often referred to in the Journal of Researches. So, in fact, part of what Darwin was discovering here is that there were, he didn't have this full, I'm jumping ahead here because he didn't have this all worked out at this time. But he had a sense that these finches, Darwin's finches, are famous because he found, anybody know about Darwin's finches? Anything? You've come across it in your reading? Yeah.
What happened was he found a whole bunch of finches on the different islands that were each had very different adaptations from each other, but they were all still finches. I think one of them was very good at eating soft, non-shelled bugs, and one of them could only eat fruits, and a different one could only eat nuts or something. And they had all these very specific beak adaptations that allowed them to fill this one purpose, but didn't really work well for anything else.
Yeah, so they have specialized.
And they were finches. So what's going on here? What does the phrase adaptive radiation suggest? It's not a phrase Darwin used, but
Well, that's an example of what we were just talking about. You've got one finch, floating around, and you've got all these different islands, each with slightly different terrains, landscapes, and food available for the finches that should, they'll adapt to the environment of the island that they're on.
So they specialize.
Right.
So this is, if you will, version of division of labor. In other words, not quite, but they have specialized into their various in the framework of this environment and what it has to offer. What sorts of forces drive this specialization? Charles.
We have Darwin talks about the variation, how things can vary, and that like doesn't always come from like, they're at least slightly different. And so we take, given that and limitation of resources and like the powers of natural selection, like things not every finch that was born is gonna live, and some have to die, and the ones that will die are the ones that can't utilize the resources that they can find, and so maybe some of a specific beak they find something and they survive and they pass on their trait.
Okay.
Yeah,
It actually just hit for me. I'm a little slow, but this is very similar to how humans take up different like jobs and specializations, like how Smith was talking about. Like it's about efficiency and progress, and the finch species is trying to propagate by reproduction and so forth. In many ways, just like humans are specializing to help ourselves as a race too.
Interesting. Yes,
that's a good. That's a very helpful parallel. The difference is there's one key difference here. I mean, it's an excellent parallel to think with. What is the key difference between the way that humans do it and the way that it happens with finches?
Sorry?
Well, for the finches, I don't know if they have some kind of plot to take over the world with their finch species. But with humans, oftentimes there's like some kind of drive or motivation. Like if we can populate this space, do something here, then like this will lead to so and so. And with the finches, I don't know necessarily that their goal was to propagate about the islands.
Do they have a finch conference? Where
yeah,
say,
exactly.
Okay,
I think maybe it was.
You're in specialized.
It was more that they maybe had too many finches in one place, so then one winter, one group migrated to a different island per se, and they came across different types of food, and those that happened to have a beak that would allow them to eat that food more efficiently than the others.
They wouldn't have to
migrate. They could just stay where they are.
Yeah,
But
they could just cross or if they just crossed the stream and went to the next place and they found some type of new food, then they would just have that adaptation that would take place.
Also, like it shows up like in humans much quicker. So like we're saying, all humans start out the same, generally for the first 12 years or so, and then that those first 12 years represents a couple hundred generations in the bird before they start to specialize. So it's really sped up in the human course.
Okay,
humans diversify through intentional strategies. There's some kind of pre-thought to it. I mean, yeah, let's create a new product, or let's do this new innovative thing, or so human culture works through a conscious process. Purposeful is purposeful. There's a purpose. Maybe the purpose doesn't work all the time, but there's some kind of intentionality behind it. These finches. This is a problem for Darwin. Why? I mean, how is this kind of radiation? What's driving it? And he's not quite sure. I mean, nobody quite knows exactly what Darwin thought at exactly what moment, but he wrote things out and so forth, and it's clear he's groping toward a mechanism here. And that mechanism is going to ultimately be the core of his book titled The Origin of Species. And the mechanism is? No.
So how does natural selection relate
to this? Not that he has a full developed theory at this point with these finches. Later he does. So how does natural selection work in contrast to change in human cultures that is driven by intentional efforts? Yeah, Chris.
It could have been that the birds specialized in that manner in order to gain an advantage over competing organisms in their spaces.
Okay, how do they get the advantage?
By specializing in.
Does the specialization change them, or does the specialization result from some change? important to think directionally here, yes.
Just like random mutations that occur among the species. Like one day, one of the birds is born with a different shaped beak, and that turns out to be useful, and then helps it survive. And since that one can survive better, it produces more offspring, which also have the mutation.
Yeah. So
variation in nature, chapter 2. Things change. You look even at things like the ganglia of an insect, and you can find variations from individual to individual. This is the material. This is the material of adaptation. So yes, part of this this work of Darwin, and part of his interest in going on his voyage was to study geology. Darwin was fascinated with the geological innovations of his time, and there were a number of people who contributed to the development of geology, much more complicated than I can go into here. But the fact is Darwin was quite aware of the emergence of the science of geology in his time and how advanced and rapidly developing it was. One of his close friends turned out to be one of his very, very closest friends was Charles Lyell. And Lyell had published his Principles of Geology in 1830 to 32. Darwin was familiar with the first volume, and indeed got hold of the second volume on his voyage. And he was fascinated with this effort to try to understand the Earth through understanding the structure of its geological makeup. And at the heart of this was a kind of a discipline of stratigraphy, of understanding time-related phenomena through careful understanding of the way in which various layers of the Earth had been formed in time. And so this was very much a subject of Lyell and many earlier thinkers as well, including Hutton. And so Charles Lyell himself used stratigraphy to develop a system for figuring out the time of certain layers of the Earth through calculating the percentage of small mollusks remaining that existed in the current time. So as he went further and further down through certain strata, he found fewer and fewer modern forms of mollusks and more ancient forms. And you can see some of the forms that he's working with down there. You can see how this interest in understanding vast portions of the Earth was, you can see the scale of it. I mean, we're now talking about a whole new framework of thinking about the physical environment. I mean, this was, we think of Hume as somebody who was anticipating certain types, but nothing like this. This is massive new field of geological science. And it was developing around a whole series of ways of measuring and figuring out the age of various layers. So as I sent in this slide that I sent out to you, I don't know if you had time to read it, I hope you do, so it gives you a little bit of background. And out of this emerged a doctrine that is sometimes referred to as uniformitarianism. Has anybody ever come across that concept or doctrine? It's part of this naturalism that I've been talking about, this naturalistic thinking. It fits into a kind of a philosophical framework of naturalism. What is uniformitarianism? It's defined, we could call it the formation of geological phenomena by forces still in action. What does that mean? What are we? What's new or different about this approach to thinking? This was a whole new notion that the features of the Earth, even the mountains and the deep oceans, had all been formed through forces that were in operation right now. There's nothing new. And these forces right now are still in operation, and these changes are still taking place. Why hasn't anybody figured this out or come up with a theory about this before? Chris?
They've accepted that such designs and variations in nature have occurred from some intelligent designer.
Okay, that's one. Yes, there's always the so many things are the way they were made by the Creator. I mean, that's always one way of putting it. But the problem partially of identifying these forces is humans live very short time span in geological terms, do they not? I mean, it's not something you just sort of sit and watch, the cliffs of Dover slowly rise hundreds of feet in the air. I mean, you'd have to live thousands, if not millions of years. So if you could show that they are rising incrementally a quarter of an inch a year, or sinking incrementally a quarter of an inch a year in uniformitarian theory, that would be profoundly important. Because just think if you have 1 million years to work with. 1 million times a quarter of an inch starts adding up to real change. So this was the sort of thinking that was being introduced by these geologists, that all these features of the land, and indeed that the land masses themselves, most of them had been underneath the ocean. How did the chalk cliffs of Dover and many of these different formations, how did those form? Where did they form? What's the origin of the chalk? How did it form? Think it was birds who ate it and dropped their droppings over a period of time, or where does the chalk come from? Anybody know what chalk is made up of?
Is it calcium oxide?
No.
It's shells of
Shells of sea organisms.
So where did the chalks? Where did the cliffs of Dover, which are famous for their chalk formations, where do they come from? Claire?
They come from the ocean, like the animals.
How did they get into the? I mean, from what ocean? Where?
I guess when they were underground.
Okay.
They rose by a quarter inch per year for many, many years.
All right. Yes. So it became clear that many formations, and some of them at the very highest level, at very high up had been formed under the ocean. These were land masses that at one time existed under oceans. And some of them are thousands of feet high now. So the new geology was beginning to come up with ideas and theories about how these things could have risen. And the concept of the changing land masses became part of that whole set of deliberations. And it became widely understood that England, many parts of England had been under the ocean more than once. So these were things that were astounding to people. The idea that, where you exist, what you walk on, you think of as solid ground, it had indeed been under the ocean at some period of time. Okay, so this came up. This gave rise to a kind of style of thinking about Earth phenomena, that was called, Lyell called it uniformitarianism. It's a form of incrementalism, and it's also a methodological approach to understanding the phenomena that you're looking at geologically. And you have this vast period of time to work with now. So in his Principles of Geology, Charles Lyell started in the frontispiece. He had this Temple of Serapis. And so this was a temple. This was in Italy. This was a temple in Italy that had all these little, right in the midsection, you can see these deformations, this area of, and these were the results of places where little mollusks had attached themselves and kind of, through ages and ages, etched out little kind of chunks of the stone. And here they were, this temple is raised above the ocean level here. So this suggested to Lyell that even in human history, you know, these things have actually happened in human history. This thing has been under the water at some time in its long history. And now here it is above the water, and this was kind of his illustration. Right in the front of it, that's the first photograph, the first graphic in this work. It's not a photograph. It introduced this notion of incrementalism, of uniformitarianism. I can never pass up this. You can get this as a chart from the USGS, United States Government Service, Geological Service. This is a poster, but it sort of shows this whole succession of time. But this notion of time as being something that is vast and goes way, way beyond. What does that happen to the individual human? How about these characters like Darwin and Lyell sitting in the 19th century trying to place themselves in this world? How does this change the perspective of humans? Where do you think humans exist on this cartwheel, this spiral here?
It just makes each of us as individuals seem really trivial. But I guess for me the amazing thing is the fact that Darwin, one individual, contributed so much to coming up with this idea and explaining how time had passed. So then that kind of counters the idea that none of us really matter in this grand scale, because maybe the fact that he could come up with an explanation for such a long period of time says that we can make
yeah, I mean, this is why we like, why some people like science. I mean, it's fascinating to understand these things. But yeah, I mean, the section in which humans exist is just a little tiny fingernail slice at the end here in time. So, for some people, it's a lot to kind of try to comprehend. Just easier to say, hey, make this go away, and I don't really believe it. So let's just not believe it. It's like, it's belief. We're going to put it up to, I either believe it or I don't believe it. Well, this vast enterprise of science has delivered us to this stage of understanding the existence that we're part of. I'm sure most people in this room, at least, would say, hey, I'll take this understanding over the bliss of thinking, well, I'm the most important thing in the universe, and it was thrilling for the people who were studying and learning about this, and for the people who could follow them, and ultimately, larger and larger numbers of people in the 19th century began to understand that, yeah, there's this tremendous period of time that we are part of, but it really precedes us by millions and millions of years. And that in itself was fascinating. And as people quarry these things, many of these sediments reveal all kinds of weird structures that nobody knows how to explain. One of the famous ones was Dr. Hoffman's Mosasaurus. This was kind of a primitive crocodilian form that they discovered. See if this was a form that was discovered in 1770, and then it was found in many other locations. Here's one of the early. Here's an early version. This is actually in Kansas, but you can see what they were finding in some of these quarries. They were actually finding stuff that nobody. It didn't resemble anything that anybody was familiar with, and so people were scratching their heads. They were trying to understand. Well, maybe these were just quote monsters that I don't know. Came and existed from some other era that nobody understands anything about. But if you are a systematist, and you're like the comparative anatomist Cuvier, who we've talked about on a couple occasions, you say, hey, this is interesting. Where does this fit into my chart? It looks different from anything I've seen that I've dissected live, but yeah, I see those teeth. I can recognize, So there were many people who began to think, well, how can we bring this into the system that we understand? I mean, this is going back to this principle of, we explain the unknown through the principles of the known. And so this effort was taking place too. And so Mosasaurus was just one. Okay, so, and there were many people, like Cuvier was the comparative anatomist, William Buckland, Gideon Mantell. These were all people who specialized in thinking about prehistoric era and the fossils that emerged and how to put these into some kind of orderly connection with the things we know now. And they had various, none of these people was a evolutionist in the sense of Charles Darwin. But they all had a sense that, these organisms were part of a past that we only imperfectly understand. And, this phenomenon was quite extensive. There were many, many people studying fossils. Fossils became quite popular among just, people who were fascinated with going out into nature. There was a whole sense of that things had changed dramatically on the land that people existed on. Here's a painting by Henry de la Beche, who was a geologist, and it's called a more ancient Dorset. So Dorset is an area of England, and many of these fossils were discovered. Mary Anning was a very famous fossil finder. She went out and she knew more about fossils and in the field and how to find them and how to present them than most of these university people. So they actually went to her for supplies and things of that sort. She was a formidable fossil finder. And, they'd find all these ancient forms. So the fact that, the place you lived in existed in other shapes and forms. There were a lot of evolutionary theories before Darwin. most of them were teleological, that is, purpose-driven. There was some purpose being sought. Darwin's is non-teleological. Cuvier, the comparative anatomist, he was not receptive to evolutionary, the concept that the forms that he studied so brilliantly had arrived through evolution. But he did as much as anybody to prepare materials that people who wanted to think about evolution could use. So he showed all these different forms. Darwin, Buffon, who was another Frenchman, who he had a sort of, he wrote a large collection of works on the organic world, which he showed all the different forms. Erasmus Darwin, who was the grandfather of Charles, had a whole progressive theory of biological change. Lamarck was probably the key person before Darwin, although he was not well received in his own time. He believed in, purpose-driven adaptation. Things, in order to become more successful, would adapt. The giraffe was an example he used, many others. All this gets us to the grand work itself, which we will, of course, explore in more detail next time. But as we have already heard, this is there's a pattern here. Darwin had noticed that there's tremendous kind of variation that takes place under domestication. And these forms, he looked at these pigeons and these primitive sunflowers on the left, and then the modern sunflower to the right after it had been, all these showed an incredible change in native stocks. So he says in this first chapter, breeders, so before what are the two things that drive the change in domestic organisms? What are humans trying to achieve? Why do they change them? Why do they selectively breed them? For what purposes? It's usually either for utility or for aesthetic. And utility is an example of the sunflower. It, as you selectively breed, you get a larger and larger flower, you get more and more seeds, you get more and more oil and nutrients and so on and so forth. That's generally the way that agricultural selection has gone for thousands and thousands of years. When did this start? When does Darwin think this started? In historical time? It's been going on for thousands of years. He doesn't know when. Nobody knows when. I mean, these forms have been, today we can kind of nail down periods because we know more anthropologically, and we can go study and we can carbon date and we can do all these different things for certain types of implements and so on. But Darwin didn't know. He just knew that domestication had been taking place for thousands of years. It was prehistoric. And nobody wrote a book and said, well, here's how you can do this, and you should go out and improve your herd of sheep and so on. It's just been done by a process that he calls unconscious selection. People just do it because they know they get, if they've got it's very logical. If you have a goat that gives a lot of milk and is very, very unusual and strong, hey, you want another one. So, and you got a big, strong animal that you can breed with it, it's kind of a no-brainer. You just try to control the breeding process. And, you get offspring. And maybe, of the 3 offspring you get, one of them is really, really great, and the other 2, which ones do you end up eating? You eat the ones that are not producing as well as the others. You keep your finest stock for breeding. That's just the way it's been done. And the same thing, something similar to that goes for plants. You get a big, strong plant, and it gives a lot. You save some of those seeds. Which seed do you eat? You eat the seed of the average. You try to take the seeds from. So it's just a natural process. So he says breeders habitually speak of an animal's organization as something quite plastic, which they can model almost as they please. Hewitt, who is a breeder, who is probably better acquainted with the works of agriculturalists than almost any other individual, speaks of the principle of selection, this is artificial selection, as, quote, that which enables the agriculturalist not only to modify the character of his stock, but to change it altogether. It is the magician's wand by means of which he may summon into life whatever form and mold he pleases. Well, that's a little over the top, but it's definitely the principle. And this has been so. Nobody's going to argue with this. I mean, who would? Even if you don't know any science, if you know anything about farms, and this is just the way it works. Domestic breeds. The whole unconscious selection is visual. It's purposive in the sense that there's something behind it, but it's not self-consciously purposive. And so Darwin refers to lots of early versions that it's a visual process. You select through the information you get visually by inspecting your herd. Okay, what happens to these highly selected breeds when they go back to nature? Okay. He has this term in here he uses, reversion. What is reversion?
Well, I mean, not necessarily. There's the possibility that they would revert back to their original state just because, again, maybe like their new traits wouldn't do well in nature, and so then the ones that had some kind of trace of what they'd had before would persist, and then those would breed. Then there's a chance that like the human changes that had been imposed on the species might be beneficial, so then they wouldn't revert when they would propagate, and the other ones would be wiped out.
That's an interesting question you raise. In Darwin's framework, in his day, he had no examples of that. They all reverted. But in our day, we know that people are worried about changes that we make that are hardwired into the genome, and maybe they won't go away. Maybe they. So the theory has been sort of, well, if this highly altered stuff gets out into the wild, it'll just die because it can't compete with the original forms, which are adapted at a very high level. And in Darwin's day, that was true.
The ones bred by humans have adapted to the barnyard.
Yeah, exactly. And the minute they get out, the interbreeding process and so forth, they go back to the form that's closer to the ancestral form, the naturally selected form. So reversion is a very important principle, and it shows that these forms revert and reemerge, get reabsorbed. So the principle of plasticity. The plasticity isn't in the lifetime of the form, it's across a series of forms, and that's why some people have a hard time understanding. Somebody wants to say, well, when you show me how a monkey turns into a human, I'll believe in evolution, and that's just totally weird way of putting it. But you can understand how people, they don't see transmission within the individual organism. They don't really believe the change, but if you look through the pattern of change over time, it gets added up into very impressive things, and you get things like these pigeons, which are absolutely beautiful, but they have no function in nature. They're totally bred for aesthetic purposes. This is called the Victoria crowned pigeon, and pigeon breeders were, pigeon breeding was a popular thing in Darwin's day. It still is. A lot of people still breed pigeons. Okay, then variation under nature. So he moves in. I just had you read a snippet of this chapter, but it builds on the last chapter. So what's he saying here? Variation under nature.
Like if you take each fly, between them, their nervous system's way different, even though the base of it is the same.
Yeah.
Each individual one's way
Yeah.
different.
Something as uniform as an insect form actually shows variation at the level of the fine anatomy, anatomical. And that variation is the substance. That is the material available for selection. Why is variation under nature so much more powerful? Variation and selection in nature so much more powerful than artificial, domesticated selection, artificial selection.
We can't really control what happens within the genome. We can only take what we have to work with and modify those traits. Whereas in nature, something completely random could come up. You know, like, I don't know, could sprout a third eye and be able to have, like,
Okay, that's part of
3D
it.
vision, whereas we can't select for that and say, like, oh, well, this one has an eye in the front, this one has an eye in the back, so we can add them together. Like, it just doesn't work that way. So
What is selection based on the selection process? What is the material available for giving cues to selection under domestic forms? And how does that differ for what is available for change in selection in natural selection?
I was just gonna say, like, artificial selection is just based on, like, the surface and exterior traits, but natural selection is based on, like, everything.
Everything. It could be, you know, the pH level of your blood or something, or, you know, it could be, it's everything. Natural selection, everything in the organism is up for variation and everything is up for selection. And that could be things quite invisible and quite removed from anybody's awareness. So natural selection is just, it's a much more powerful process. Yeah.
One thing I might add to that is that natural selection allows you to have potentially positive changes that are cannot be predicted or expected for, because whenever you are trying to, you know, cure or move forward, you know, generations of dogs or cattle or whatever, you can only breed for what you've already seen deemed to be useful or worthy. But should mutations turn out that you can't expect, you know, that's a real benefit there. Is, you know, suddenly amazing things can happen that you know, you shouldn't be so arrogant as to think you know exactly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the trimming force of survival will find it, because the thing that can last for n plus as opposed to just n amount of time lives to breed and transmit.
Also, the pool is just so much bigger and natural, so you're going to get so many more variations that some really good ones are going to come up rather than domestic. It's a lot smaller pool.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have to finish here. So next time I'm going to start with Chapter 3, Struggle for Existence, but we've captured some of the introductory elements here